I slam the cardboard box onto the kitchen floor so hard that the tape splits open. Something inside shatters. A mug, maybe a plate. But I don't even flinch. My hands are trembling, my breath sharp and uneven, my chest so tight I can barely pull air into my lungs. I drop another box and it lands sideways, spilling clothes across the cracked tile floor. The cheap overhead bulb flickers once, then steadies, throwing a harsh, unforgiving light over the tiny apartment I can barely afford. My phone vibrates on the counter. Again, the same number that's been chasing me for days like a ghost I can't outrun. The same message that makes my stomach drop every time I see it. I grab the phone with shaking fingers, swipe the screen with my thumb, and freeze when I see the new notification glowing bright against the darkness of everything else. Final notice, immediate action required. My grip slips. The phone hits the ground with a sharp crack. Before I continue, if stories like this resonate with you, I'd love for you to subscribe to Pause That Healed. And tell me in the comments if you've ever lived something similar. Your story matters here. I kneel to pick it up, but my knees give out halfway and I end up sitting hard on the cold floor, surrounded by boxes and broken things and the sound of my own uneven breathing. My throat burns. My vision blurs at the edges. I press the heel of my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, to keep from breaking completely right here in this empty apartment that smells like dust and failure. Behind me, something soft brushes against the back of my arm, a warm nose, a slow, steady breath, a presence that doesn't judge or question or demand anything from me. I turn my head and there he is. Rufus sits beside me, his dark brown eyes fixed on mine, ears slightly lowered, tail still, not wagging, just waiting. He leans the weight of his body gently against me, like he can feel the collapse happening inside my chest, and is trying to hold the pieces in place with nothing but his warmth. My exhale breaks. I lean into him, and for a moment in this apartment that feels too small and too loud and too full of endings, the only thing grounding me to this world is the warm, steady heartbeat pressed against my arm. And that's when I realized I wasn't facing this alone. I'm Susan Carter, and I live, or used to live, in Las Vegas, Nevada. A place that shines so brightly on the outside that people assume you're doing fine as long as the lights are still on. But the truth is quieter than the casino, softer than the neon glow that fills the night sky. You can lose everything here without anyone noticing. You can disappear into the background of all that brightness and no one will see you falling. The financial collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, like water slowly filling a room, until one day you realize you're drowning and you don't know when it started. First, there was the layoff. I worked in hospitality management for nearly 8 years, and one Tuesday morning in March, I received an email with the subject line, organizational restructuring. I read it 3 times before the words actually registered. My position had been eliminated, effective immediately. There was no warning, no conversation, no chance to prepare. Just a severance package that wouldn't even cover 2 months of rent. Then came the medical bills. My mother had fallen ill the year before, and I'd flown back and forth to help her, covering costs that insurance refused to touch. I didn't regret it, I'd do it again. But the credit card balance grew quietly in the background. And by the time I noticed, the interest had compounded into something I couldn't manage. Rent in Las Vegas kept climbing. My savings evaporated. I applied to dozens of jobs, maybe hundreds, and heard nothing back. Silence became its own kind of rejection. I started selling furniture piece by piece. The couch I'd loved, the bookshelf my father built, the kitchen table where I used to have friends over for dinner. I canceled subscriptions, stopped going out, stopped answering calls from friends who wanted to meet up because I couldn't afford a single drink and didn't want to explain why. The loneliness was the worst part. Living in a city where everyone seems to be performing happiness, where the baseline is excess and celebration, and you're quietly shrinking in the corner, trying to hold on to your dignity with both hands. I stayed in bed too long some mornings, not because I was tired, because I didn't want to face another day of applications that went nowhere, bills I couldn't pay, and a future that felt like it was closing in on me. The shame was constant. I remembered the day I packed my belongings into boxes, not because I was moving towards something better, but because I was being pushed out. My landlord had been patient, but patience has limits. I found a tiny apartment on the edge of the city, far from the strip, far from the life I used to know. It was affordable, barely, and that was all that mattered. The day I moved, the desert heat pressed down on everything. The air smelled like dust and gasoline. I loaded boxes into my car in silence, my hands shaking, my chest tight with the weight of everything I'd lost. And through it all, through the layoffs, the bills, the selling, the packing, the shame, the loneliness, there was Rufus. He didn't understand the notices or the numbers or the fear that kept me awake at night, but he understood me. He followed me from room to room. He sat beside me when I cried. He rested his head on my lap when I couldn't find the strength to move. And as I drove toward that tiny apartment, boxes piled high in the back seat, Rufus sat calmly beside me, watching me through the rearview mirror like a silent promise. Everything else was falling apart, but Rufus never left my side. And that's when I realized his role in my life was about to change. Rufus came into my life 3 years before the collapse. Back then, everything was different. I had stability, a job I enjoyed, a spacious apartment with a balcony that overlooked the city lights. I adopted him from a rescue shelter on a sunny Saturday afternoon, drawn to the way he sat quietly in the corner of his kennel, watching me with calm, knowing eyes. He wasn't jumping or barking like the other dogs. He was just waiting. The shelter volunteer told me he'd been found wandering the outskirts of the city. No collar, no chip, no history. Just a dog who'd survived on his own and somehow kept his gentleness intact. I named him Rufus because it felt strong and steady. 2 things I didn't know I'd need him to be. For years, he was my companion. We walked together in the evenings. He slept at the foot of my bed. He greeted me at the door every day with his tail wagging and his ears perked up. Life was good, and Rufus was part of that goodness. But when everything started to fall apart, something shifted. Rufus stopped being just a companion. He became my anchor. The first time I noticed it was the night I received the eviction notice at my old apartment. I sat on the couch with the letter in my hands, reading the words over and over, trying to make them mean something different. My breathing was shallow. My hands were cold. My mind was racing through options I didn't have. Rufus walked over slowly, sat directly in front of me, and stared into my eyes. Not begging for attention, not asking to play, just there, steady, grounded, like a silent promise that I wasn't alone. I reached out and buried my fingers in the soft fur behind his ears, and for the first time that night, I could breathe again. That became the pattern. Every time I broke down, and I broke down often, Rufus was there. When I packed boxes, and suddenly couldn't stop crying over an old photograph of my mother. Rufus nudged my hand with his nose until I stopped and petted him. When I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, trying to muffle my sobs so the neighbors wouldn't hear, Rufus pushed the door open with his paw and lay down beside me without a sound. On moving day, he sat in the back seat of my car, surrounded by boxes, his head resting on the edge of the seat, watching me through the rearview mirror. I was shaking. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. But every time I glanced back at him, he was calm, unshaken, like he was telling me we're going to be okay. The first night in the new apartment was the hardest. The space was so small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, a living room that felt more like a hallway. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbors arguing. The fluorescent light in the bathroom buzzed constantly. Everything felt temporary and fragile, like I was living in a place that wasn't really mine. I tried to sleep on the mattress I'd placed directly on the floor. I'd sold the bed frame weeks ago, but I couldn't. My mind wouldn't stop. The bills, the job search, the shame, the fear of what came next. Rufus, who usually slept on his dog bed in the corner, climbed up beside me. He rested his head on my chest, and every time my breathing changed, every time it got too fast, too shallow, he shifted his weight slightly, pressing down just enough to remind me he was there. I wrapped my arms around him and finally closed my eyes. That night, in that tiny apartment that smelled like old carpet and someone else's life, Rufus became more than my dog. He became my guide. The one steady thing in a world that had become unrecognizable. The one presence that didn't demand anything from me except to keep breathing. And as I drifted off to sleep with his warm body curled against mine, I realized something I hadn't been able to see before. Rufus wasn't just with me. He was guiding me. And that's when the healing began. The healing didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, quiet routines, the kind of shifts you don't notice until you look back and realize you're not the same person you were a month ago. It started with mornings. For weeks after the move, I'd wake up and lie in bed staring at the ceiling, dreading the day ahead. But Rufus didn't let me stay there. Every morning, around the same time, he'd nudge my hand with his nose, gently at first, then more insistently if I didn't move. At first I resented it. I wanted to stay in bed. I wanted to disappear into sleep and not think about job applications or bills or the weight pressing down on my chest. But Rufus didn't care what I wanted. He cared that I got up. So I did. I'd shuffle into the tiny kitchen, my feet cold on the linoleum floor, and make coffee in the cheap pot I'd bought at a thrift store. Rufus would sit beside me, his tail tapping lightly on the floor, ears perked up, watching me with those calm brown eyes. And something about that simple act, making coffee, hearing the soft rhythm of his tail, feeling the warmth of the mug in my hands, made the mornings feel a little less suffocating. Then came the walks. At first I forced myself. Rufus needed the exercise and I couldn't afford to ignore that. So every evening, just before sunset, I'd clip the leash to his collar and we'd walk through the neighborhood. The desert air was dry and warm. The sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Rufus would trot beside me, his ears fluttering in the breeze, his nose lifted slightly to catch every scent. I started noticing things. The way the light turned golden just before dusk, the sound of wind chimes on someone's porch, the rhythm of our steps together, steady and even, the way Rufus would pause at certain spots, sniffing the ground with complete focus, like the world was full of mysteries I'd forgotten to see. And slowly, so slowly, I didn't realize it was happening. Those walks became the part of my day I looked forward to, not because they solved anything, but because they reminded me I could still move forward. One afternoon, I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at job listings. My chest felt tight. My hands were cold. I'd been rejected so many times that applying felt pointless, like shouting into a void that never answered back. Rufus walked over and rested his head on my lap. I looked down at him and he stared back at me with those steady, unblinking eyes. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the softness, the warmth, the weight of him grounding me to the moment. And I applied, not because I thought it would work, but because Rufus made me feel like I could try again. Small routines started coming back. I began folding laundry with music playing softly in the background. I cooked simple meals, pasta, eggs, toast, and Rufus would sit in the kitchen doorway watching me like I was doing something important. I opened the blinds in the mornings to let the sunlight in. I cleaned the apartment slowly, one corner at a time, with Rufus following me like a shadow. There was one afternoon that I'll never forget. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by all the bills that had once terrified me, credit card statements, medical invoices, past due notices, trying to organize them into something manageable. My hands were shaking. My breathing was shallow. The numbers felt impossible. Rufus walked over slowly, stepped carefully over the papers, and lay down across my legs. His weight was warm and solid. His breathing was slow and even, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I sat there with my hand resting on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, and something inside me softened. The bills were still there. The debt was still real, but I wasn't facing it alone. A few weeks later, I got a call for an interview. I was sitting on the couch, absently petting Rufus, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten used to silence, but something made me pick up. It was a hiring manager for a small hotel downtown. They wanted to meet with me. I hung up and sat there staring at my phone, my heart pounding. Rufus nudged my hand with his nose. I looked down at him, and he was watching me with that same calm, steady gaze. And instead of fear, I felt something else. Hope. Quiet, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. The apartment that once felt like a cage started feeling different. It was still small. The walls were still thin. The rent was still a stretch. But it stopped feeling like an ending. It started feeling like a beginning, a tiny, imperfect, rebuilding kind of beginning. And Rufus was at the center of it all. He didn't fix my life. He didn't make the bills disappear, or bring back the job I lost, or erase the shame I carried. But he made healing possible. He reminded me every single day that I was still here, that I could still get up in the morning, that I could still take a step forward, even if it was small, that I wasn't alone. And slowly, one quiet moment at a time, I started to believe him. It's early morning now. The sun is just starting to rise over the edges of Las Vegas, casting a soft golden light through the small kitchen window. The city is waking up outside, distant traffic humming. Birds calling from somewhere beyond the rooftops. The day stretching out clean and new. I make coffee in silence, the familiar sound of water dripping into the pot filling the quiet space. Rufus sits at my feet, his body warm against my leg, his tail tapping softly on the floor. He watches me with those calm brown eyes, patient and steady, like he's been doing every morning for the past few months. I sit down on the floor with my coffee mug cradled in both hands, and Rufus immediately curls into my side, resting his head on my thigh. The apartment is still small. The walls are still thin. I can still hear my neighbors moving around above me, but it doesn't feel the same anymore. It feels like mine, like a safe little world I rebuilt from the ground up, one piece at a time, with my dog beside me every step of the way. I didn't regain my life overnight. I'm still rebuilding, still budgeting carefully, still working a job that's not quite where I want to be, still paying off debt that will take years to clear. But I'm no longer carrying the weight alone. Rufus taught me something I'd forgotten in the middle of all that collapse, that healing doesn't have to be loud or fast or dramatic. It can be quiet, it can be slow. It can happen in the morning light of a tiny kitchen with a dog curled at your feet and a warm mug in your hands. He taught me that survival isn't about fixing everything at once. It's about getting up, taking one step, breathing through the hard moments, and letting someone or something remind you that you're worth the effort. I run my hand along Rufus's back, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The sun climbs higher outside the window, filling the room with soft, golden light. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Not be everything is perfect, but because I'm no longer afraid. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps this community grow. And if a dog has ever changed your life, feel free to share your story with us. I thought I was saving him, but he saved me.